Welcome to the Edinburgh Talks Climate podcast. I'm David Porteous. This time we're going to be talking about sustainable travel. And joining me today are Sonia Perez, who's a Climate Commission Officer working for the Alliance for Sustainability Leadership in Education. Hi, Sonia.
Hi.
And Rosanna Harvey-Crawford, who's a Project Officer at the Edinburgh Centre for Carbon Innovation. Hello, Rosanna.
Hello.
The travel bit of this is a little bit tricky for us, really, as a country. In 1841, Thomas Cook arranged the very first package holiday. That was back on the 5th of July, 1841, and it included some ham sandwiches and a brass band. Nobody actually travelled abroad at that point, but it seems like since the 1970s, package holidays have become a massive part of British culture, and that going away somewhere warm for the summer has become pretty normal for a lot of the people, maybe even most of the people who live in the UK. Is that fair, Sonia?
Well, interestingly, I would say that it is a massive part of our culture, and we see it all the time on Instagram and in the news, and all our friends talking about it. But actually, I think it was an organization called Climate 1010. I think they're called Possible now. They did a survey, and 15% of UK residents actually contribute or are responsible, rather, for 75% of flights. So not everyone's traveling. It's really just an elite few, and it's not just in the UK as well. We see these kind of trends in Sweden and in other parts of the world. But it is really fascinating that we see it as such a massive part of the world and of our culture and of our personal and professional lives. But actually not a lot of people, or not as many people as we think, are flying. And I think this has really interesting implications for the climate crisis as well, where we see an elite few doing activities that really affect the poor in the global north and south and in general. So I do agree that it's part of our culture. I wouldn't say that it's a part of everyone's life, though. Yeah.
So is it very much skewed towards more affluent people? So that is people taking multiple holidays, traveling by air for business, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah. So a more recent survey, I think it was Department for Transport, found that 10% of people take more than half of our flights in England. And so I think 48% of people just haven't flown in the past year. So it really is frequent flyers. And we see this in business as well, and in the higher education sector where I work, where it is few people taking multiple flights and really seeing flying as this right rather than as a privilege. Yeah.
We've done some work in Edinburgh. Edinburgh, of course, a little bit more affluent than the Scottish average, of course, and we've seen higher numbers because of that affluence doing more flying in the last year. And when we start talking about alternatives to flying, some of which we'll come on to later, the thing that surprised me most is the extent to which most people have never even considered some of those alternatives to flying, particularly as part of leisure trips as well. But flying is the most environmentally impactful method of travel. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we have to take into consideration length of trip and other factors. But in general, yes, flying is the most carbon intensive form of travel.
Is there something about how the release of this is maybe too much science? It's a little bit too much science for me. But is there something about how the same emissions being released at higher altitudes are potentially much more damaging than they would be if they were at ground level?
Yeah, so that's a massive factor. That's called radiative forcing. And actually,
wow, that is too much science. That's so much science. No, tell me, radiative forcing, that's excellent.
I actually don't know too much about it. I do know that when we measure the impact of air travel, a lot of those measurements don't actually even account for radiative forcing. So the impact that we understand of air travel isn't even the extent. So it's an even larger impact. And I think that's a really good point. That's part of the reason why it's so bad, but that's not what your everyday person would think about, really. So it's even worse than we think it is, essentially. So it's because of that, and it's also just because it burns a lot of fuel, emits a lot of greenhouse gases. And another massive thing is, of course, just the demand. So it's increasing in demand. It's just going to become a bigger part of our carbon budget.
Is that for the UK, or is that a global increase in demand?
Globally. So right now, air travel accounts for, not considering radiative forcing, accounts for, I think, less than 5% of our global entire greenhouse gas emissions, but it's projected to account for more than 20%. So these factors, it's really carbon intensive, as well as the increasing demand, as well as radiative forces that make air travel just really environmentally unsound.
Okay. And is that the only impact that we need to be concerned about for flying? Is it just the environmental impacts, or are we looking at other things that are more likely to negatively impact us as a result of flying?
Yeah, of course. Well, I think that there is such an interesting culture around flying where it is an elite few that are flying, but it's so glamorized and sort of normalized, and everyone strives to, have this really international global life, which you have to do. Well, I don't think you have to do it by flying, but it's kind of assumed that you do it by flying. And
so there are lots of people who are doing this for the gram, essentially.
Absolutely. I've read, there's actually academic articles about hashtags and about, this flight blogs and Instagram influencers who love to fly. So it is a massive part of our culture. And I think it does sort of stratify society between those who fly and those who don't, and those who are international and those who aren't international. And I think in careers as well, so in business and in the higher education sector, it's so often linked to career progression. So you're expected to be this global employee, this global researcher. And I suppose people assume that entails air travel. And so that does sort of hinder social mobility and the idea of who can be what. So that's definitely a social implication from flying and from flying culture. And of course, flying propels the climate crisis, and the climate crisis will affect the global north, the world's poor in the global north and the global south. So by participating in a structure that is flying, the social implications are, of course, flooding and droughts and lack of food from agricultural consequences. So, yeah.
And all the people who are most negatively impacted by all of that aren't the people who are getting any positive benefit from flying in the first place.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah.
We tend to be a little bit divorced from that sort of thing in Scotland. Generally speaking, perceptions of what extreme weather, climate change looks like to people who are living in Scotland is very much occasionally there will be a bit more wind than we're used to, but we don't really experience flooding. We don't really experience drought on any sort of significant scale. How do we, I suppose it's an open question as to how do we make these environmental impacts and therefore some of the social impacts that come from them a little bit more real to people who are living in Scotland, and particularly people who are living in Edinburgh, and making more of these decisions to fly?
Yeah, I'd say it would come from just talking to people. There are people that live in Edinburgh that are from parts of the world that are currently experiencing the consequences of the climate crisis. So really getting out there and trying to talk to people that have lived experience and reading. I mean, there's so much information online. Rosanna and I live in Edinburgh, but we've studied environment, and so I guess that's part of our knowledge. We don't have lived experience of these consequences, but we do know of them because of studying and learning.
I think it's also, this is something I've been thinking about, especially during coronavirus, but it's not just the consequences of climate change is often just spoken about as being extreme weather and sea level rise. And obviously these are really serious, and sea level rise in Edinburgh would mean that Leith and Granton and other places would be underwater. But it's also, I think it would be a lot more effective if we spoke about the consequences of climate change, not just as extreme weather and sea level rise. Like, coronavirus was exacerbated by travel patterns around the world and by human activity destroying ecosystems. And we've got these long supply chains for food and products that we need that span all over the globe. And they're so vulnerable to any interruption like coronavirus. So it's not just, I mean, I think when you say things like supply chains, people just think of business, and I definitely do. And I think, oh God, I don't understand that. But they do impact your daily life. Like if food becomes more expensive, that's really important and scary for a lot of people. So I think it's talking about, obviously not terrifying people and saying it's going to ruin every single aspect of your life, but just these are things that you might want to consider, as well as the fact that it might get a bit windier and a bit rainier and a bit more humid. But
yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone of my generation had ever considered food shortage to be an issue until we found there was no self-raising flour in Tesco. I think that was, in all seriousness, that was maybe an alarm bell for some of us in terms of how vulnerable supply chains actually are for these sorts of things. And obviously, I mean, we think of flying in terms of us, passengers, human beings flying, but a huge amount of Britain's food flies into this country as well, obviously.
Just going back to the social aspect of that, I think, yeah, the supply chains and coronavirus, they're all really interesting examples of climate crisis. But again, it is the world's poor that's being the most affected by all of these. So it is this idea that global north, global south, it's going to be the most marginalized and the world's poor. And flying propels this, and the elite are flying, and others are suffering the consequences.
So I suppose my first question, let's start off with maybe the least that people can do. Is there a better way to fly? Is there something that we can do where if you absolutely have to fly, then there's a different way of approaching it, a different way of thinking about it?
Yeah. Fascinatingly, fly economy, don't fly business, don't fly first class. It sounds so like, yeah, but just business and first class, you're obviously taking up a lot more resources on the plane. So your carbon footprint is, I think, around 3 times larger than it would be if you were just flying economy. So flying economy is something you can do. Another thing is you can cut part of your journey. So I flew to Canada in the summer last year, and I had the option of flying via Dublin or via London. And so I knew if I flew via London, I could take the train to London and then fly from London to Toronto, as opposed to flying from Edinburgh to Dublin, Dublin to Toronto. And so that's a small thing you can do, kind of trying to cut that layover and take a train or take a ferry instead of taking another flight. It does take more time, but you can plan ahead and ensure that you have that time. That's a small thing you can do. And I don't know, should I get into the whole can of worms that is carbon offsetting?
Yeah, open up that can of worms. I just wanted to say, first of all, who knew that Michael O'Leary and Ryanair were such champions of the environment, that they'd been really saving the planet by shoving as many people into as small a space as possible all these years. Let's talk about carbon offsetting.
Yeah, and so we have our Rosanna, if you also want to join in, we have our energy hierarchy rather, and we know that the first thing we have to do is save energy and reduce the actual amount of energy we consume and demand. And at the end of that carbon hierarchy is carbon offsetting. So if we really cannot do anything else, scientists and experts say, okay, you can carbon offset. And so flight companies and a lot of travel companies offer you the option of offsetting your flight by purchasing a carbon offset. And this is really, really tricky, and it's like quite contentious. There's a few issues with carbon offsetting where we can't actually measure it properly. So we don't actually know how much a flight is actually emitting in terms of greenhouse gases. Not just that, but if we're planting trees, we don't actually know. It takes a really long time for trees to absorb carbon. So we don't actually know if the carbon will actually be emitted. There's just other issues. So a leakage, will our carbon offset cause carbon emissions elsewhere? So people do carbon offset, and this is an option to sort of, lessen the impact of your flight or lessen the harm of your flight. But I'd say you'd probably have to do a lot of research into it and be absolutely sure that it's an appropriate carbon offset and that there's absolutely no other option for you.
So I think one of the challenges for that, in terms of, if we can talk a bit, is retail, about how the consumer makes purchasing decisions for things like that, is most people have absolutely no idea how much carbon is involved in any decision that they take. And that is actually quite difficult for an individual to determine that accurately. So this year, I think for the first time, we saw EasyJet actually build some carbon offsetting into all of their flights. Now, again, taking your point, we don't know exactly how accurate that is. And most people are not going to do a huge amount of work in terms of investigating how effective that actually is. But isn't that the sort of thing, the sort of wedge issue that we want to start putting into people's minds? So it's been an option for people for a while. Now we're starting to see it being built in automatically. Is that a good path for us to be on to then enable us to have better conversations about how good each of those solutions actually ends up being?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. So it's sort of an educational sort of avenue to learn about carbon emissions even. I do think there's danger on relying on it too much. So Professor Kevin Anderson from the Tyndall Centre is against carbon offsetting, and his argument is that it sort of allows us to rely on fossil fuel infrastructure. And so it's saying it's okay, to emit greenhouse gases if we are offset it. It's kind of just saying it's okay, you don't have to make changes elsewhere. And so I think the danger is in the culture of saying it's okay.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely correct. There's a fundamental danger with saying we have a river and we want there to be no poison in the river, but we're going to let someone pour some poison in the river upstream, and then someone else will find a way to take it out of the river again downstream.
Exactly.
There's a real problem going on for most of the river if that's our solution. But there's also more schemes which are being developed now to look at avoiding carbon being emitted in the first place. I imagine we have the same sort of issues with how effective those are, but is that a long-term solution to how we manage our own carbon emissions as well, by avoiding them being emitted elsewhere?
That carbon capture and storage.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking more, what I thought was interesting is how there are organizations operating now, which basically you have an estimated amount of carbon that your behavior will emit. Let's say we're talking about a flight. And what you can do is pay for particular solutions which will avoid carbon emissions being emitted elsewhere. So the development of solar ovens in particular countries where they don't have access to an infrastructure, where people would basically just be burning wood to cook food. And that, in a sense, avoids some carbon being emitted there.
So I'm actually, sorry, Sonia, you probably have some opinions on this as well, but so I guess I'm kind of signed up to one of those programs. I'm signed up to a carbon offsetting program that I pay £7 a month for, and it's for 10 tons of CO2 this year. And I think, just to go back to that point about you don't know how much your flight is emitting, I'm really lucky because at ECCI, one of my colleagues is a carbon accountant, and I was flying to go and see my friend in France at New Year who lives in Canada and I hadn't seen for a really long time. And I looked at the train and it was just too expensive for me. And so I calculated, Claire calculated, my colleague, the carbon, and it was, I think, 1.5 tons to go just to France, just to the south of France. So, and that's obviously without the radiative forcing. I've learned now being calculated. So I signed up to this program in the Borders, which is where I grew up, on the River Tweed, where they're doing restoration of the Tweed. And you can, sign up to this offsetting program. But I think the thing is with those types of programs, and with carbon offsetting in general, it's the question of additionality, which basically means that should those activities be happening anyway? So why should that be accounting for someone else's carbon emissions? So the cheapest carbon offsets you can buy are usually ones for building wind turbines or renewable energy infrastructure, which I think the additionality of is pretty questionable, because countries should be doing that anyway. And I think obviously the development of solar ovens for people is really great and important, but I'm not sure that should be absolving people of guilt for their carbon emissions in the global north. It's not really, I don't think it's fair to put that on people in the global south, to say that, I can fly this place, but because you're using a solar oven, it's fine. sorry, I don't want to make everyone feel dreadful this morning, but that's, I don't know, that's
the reality. Yeah. No, additionality is it's really, really difficult to prove. And that's like a key issue with why we can't entirely rely on carbon offsetting.
But I think the program like the one in the Borders, I mean, I'm not saying like I'm signed up to the best carbon offsetting program possible, but like they are doing something important, and it's part of the peatland code, which is peatland restoration in the UK, and the woodland code. And I mean, I think you can quite easily look up these things and see there's quite a lot of certification. What would you call them? Certification
standards.
Yeah, standards, that's the one.
Like Soil Association for Organic Food or something like that. Yeah,
exactly. And like one of the best ones is Gold Standard, which was created by the WWF. And I just think if you're looking at offsetting programs that are held to a really rigorous testing standard, that's great. And, you know, it can be a solution, I think, in the short term if you're trying to change your behavior and there's emissions that you can't get rid of in your day-to-day life. And that's...
So when I flew home to Canada last year, I was working on the Travel Better package, which I'll talk about later. And I felt really, I guess, pessimistic about offsets. And so what I did instead, I'd read a really interesting article about how just any kind of community support or community development is really important for the climate crisis as well. So instead of buying a carbon offset, I actually donated to the Grenfell Foundation to help families affected by Grenfell. And so in my eyes, that's still helping community development to sort of face climate change. And I think that's another interesting way. I'm not saying it's the correct way, just potentially another avenue you can go down to address your flying. Yeah, by donating to
flying guilt. Is that what we're going to call it?
Yeah, but I want to address at some point that we don't need to feel guilt for flying as well. So.
Okay. I mean, I think that's a really, really good point that we'll come on to. There's an extent, I suppose my question is, isn't there an extent to which we have to address the economics of this a little bit head on? Because whilst we still have such low levels of carbon literacy, whilst we still have most of our decisions with no carbon attached to them, in the same way that we understand the price of things, that's a huge barrier for people to make better decisions about all of their travel. And we do have, it's not necessarily an elephant in the room because we can talk about it, but we do have the situation whereby most of the travel that you do, which has fuel attached to it, will have some sort of tax attached to that fuel. So if you're driving a car somewhere, there's, in the UK certainly, a huge amount of tax which is applied to that particular fuel, which tries to influence people's decisions. Airlines don't operate in the same basis. So international travel, of course, doesn't have tax attached to airline fuel. So effectively, we as taxpayers are giving you a massive discount to fly from London to Paris rather than take the Eurostar.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I suppose why shouldn't we feel guilty about flying, or how do we fly without guilt?
Well, I think exactly that, because it's such a structural problem, and I am against this idea that it is an individual's responsibility to solve the climate crisis. I do think that we should be conscious of air travel. We should try and limit it. We should try and travel better, but we should do this while also pushing governments and the industry to take action. And I think it's their responsibility to tax jet fuel, to improve rail infrastructure, and to make it easier for us. So I don't think we should. I don't think we should feel guilty every single time we have to take a flight. I do acknowledge I'm Indian Canadian, so I have family in India and in Canada. So I completely acknowledge that, like, I have to fly sometimes. And so I think we just really need to be conscious, really reflect. And I don't think guilt is useful. Does that make sense? So I think it's a balance between, I don't know if, Rosanna, you feel the same way.
No, I mean, I think we've spoken about it before.
Yeah.
When I finished my undergraduate degree, I went traveling for 5 months, and I went to India and the Middle East. And obviously that involved several long haul flights. And I came back and I felt really guilty about it, especially when I started studying. And I think it's sometimes I think like, oh, flying, like that's the one that's the worst for the environment. Like it's just awful. Like you don't want to live in a world where you can't go and visit other places or see your family that live in another country. Like it is, I understand why it's so controversial and difficult to talk to people about it, because it's one of the greatest things that's kind of come out of the Industrial Revolution and advancement in technology is flying. But I think you do have to take responsibility. But yeah, I don't know that guilt is a useful emotion in this sense. I think it is just sort of taking responsibility for the flights that you're deciding to take, and also trying to campaign for carbon tax on flights. That seems obvious. And frequent flyer tax, like when that study came out, I remember reading online, I think it was it was probably in the Guardian, saying that there should be frequent flyer tax, because if you've got a certain 5% of people taking over half of the flights, that seems obvious that they would have to pay for that privilege. Yeah. And they probably can't afford to. So that's the way I feel about it.
That seems very reasonable. Also, you've both made me feel a lot better about the wall of shame that's behind me, which is little dots on a map of places that I've been to. I've been to Finland 3 times. Nobody needs to have gone to Finland 3 times.
No, Finland's a really nice country. I think you do.
It's fine. Go once. It's fine. And I think there's a lot of people who would like many people who've grown up in a sort of more digitally connected age. I have friends in a dozen countries around the world, and experiencing different cultures has been an enormously important part of my upbringing. And I think the idea that we would suddenly close the gate and say, well, next generation, I'm afraid that's not going to be an option for you. You're just going to have to Zoom call with people for the rest of your life, and that's going to be it. But I suppose one of the components of what we're doing when we're flying abroad is obviously leisure travel, and one of the things that we benefit from in Scotland, in some ways, certainly economically, is having a very strong tourist industry. So there are millions of people who are visiting the UK from abroad. Abroad, that's such a British term, isn't it? But visiting the UK every year. Is there more that we should be doing in terms of responsible traveling for saying, actually, let's not go to Spain. Let's go to Ayrshire instead?
Sorry,
nobody wants to throw themselves in front of that one. Okay.
It's so sensitive because, of course, like the tourism industry supports so many livelihoods and so many people. I do think there's a way, though, for sustainable tourism, for sure. And I think Scotland's stunning. It's such a beautiful country. Coming from Canada to here, I am in awe. I mean, Canada's stunning, but I'm from the city. I'm from Toronto. And so now I'm living in like the most beautiful place. And it's really stunning. I think we should really, really make the most of how beautiful Scotland is. And I think it can really benefit the economy for more localized travel as well. I just want to say Carbon Brief had said that tourism accounts for around 8%, at least a few years ago, it accounted for around 8% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think that's something to consider in terms of making tourism more localized, which is something we absolutely can do.
Any idea, is travel the biggest part of that? It's obviously not all of it, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
I think it's maybe also about like confronting what sort of tourism you want to have in Scotland. I feel like it can be really, again, something that's quite sensitive, especially in Edinburgh. Mm-hmm. It really supports the economy in a lot of ways in Edinburgh and Scotland, but then a lot of people feel very unhappy, I think, about the way that tourism has developed. And I was up in Glencoe just before lockdown, and there's a lot of coaches going through with just people getting off and taking pictures and getting back on. And I don't know, I do think it's maybe about rethinking how we want tourism to function here, because it is so important for people in the Highlands and Islands, especially, and for those local economies. So I don't think you can just say no more tourism, but maybe there needs to be, I mean, it's really Scottish Government's responsibility, I think, to think about what kind of tourism they want in Scotland and how to make it sustainable.
I think I completely agree. And I think there's a really important point in there about the value that is created by tourism. So arguably, all those coaches going through Glencoe to do the stop, and I've done that stop, just some mountains, and you take a photo, and you take the same photo that 10 million people have taken before you, and then you drive off to somewhere else, and it feels like you're not really interacting with the culture. You're not really gaining anything really significant from that experience. You're not, there's no human interaction, if you like. I feel like we could set up in Edinburgh a Glencoe visitor centre, which does the virtual experience of visiting Glencoe just as well as actually going there, and we'd save a lot of coach miles doing that.
Maybe there should be like a form before you book your tour or your flight, where it's like, what is the purpose? So it makes you really reflect on like why you want to go. It could be like Instagram, like take a picture, engage with culture. So people really reflect on why I think that's such a good point, Rosanna, to really think about what tourism actually means.
I think I also do. Sorry, Sonia. I think I also do get it, because I think sometimes the Scottish Highlands can look really intimidating. Like, you look at those mountains and they're huge, and you would think, I can't walk in there. Like, that's, but you can. There's lots of walks that you can do where you don't need to be, super young and fit. Like, loads of people could do walks in Glencoe. And I think maybe if that was encouraged a bit more, sort of going there and walking around and interacting more with the scenery, I think that would be good. And I mean, just on like a logistics level, I just don't think those roads are wide enough for all the coaches and cars going through.
Yeah. The thing about Scottish Glens, there are mountains on either side, but there's a flat bit between them. That's the bit that you're supposed to be walking on. That's my controversial view as someone long opposed to hill walking.
What has it done to you?
I went on a camping trip when I was to Perthshire, when I was at school, and I hadn't appreciated the calorific impact of doing hill walking, because I'd never done it before, and so I didn't really eat anything in the morning. Because I didn't when I was at school. And then for lunch, I just brought with me, I'm just like, I'll be thirsty. I wouldn't need anything to actually eat. So I brought a can of Diet Coke with me. And I drank that. And by the time we were coming home at the end of the walk, about 4:00, I was basically in something approaching hypoglycemic shock at that point. That mountain, which was a hill, that vast mountain tried to kill me, basically. And I'm not over it yet. So my own stupidity more than the fault of the Borders hills.
That sounds quite intense, to be fair. That's an intense experience.
But the flat bits at the bottom, lovely. Highly recommend them. So obviously we've had, as a result of COVID, this is why we're not talking face to face with one another as we have for so many of the other podcasts, and we're doing this remotely. I'm currently in my bedroom just now, where I've been for the last 4 months. It's not good. But there's been big impacts in terms on restrictions to travel, in terms of what we're able to do, and in terms of what people feel safe doing. How much do you think this is going to impact us long term? Is this something we're going to get over in like 3 months, or is this going to be a longer term impact on everyone?
Yeah, so I think I read recently that 9 in 10 from April, so when lockdown first started, 9 in 10 flights from the UK were grounded, which is like really significant. And so I work in the higher education sector, and air travel is like a really big chunk of our greenhouse gas emissions, just for business travel and for research and meetings. And the pushback against limiting flying was that, research needs to be done internationally. We need to meet face to face for projects to work. We need this to happen. We need that to happen. And now that COVID-19 has come and sort of restructured everything, I think the most fascinating aspect of all of it is that it's given people the confidence. So it's given senior management and it's given people working in the sector and just in general the confidence to conduct work and to collaborate and to learn and to teach remotely. And I mean, we've moved international conferences online. We've moved teaching assessments online. And of course, lots of it isn't perfect and it doesn't work extremely well. But I just think the idea that we can do this and we do have the ingenuity and we do have the confidence to do, I really hope that lasts when we're again faced with air travel. And for me personally, so as I mentioned, my family lives in Canada and in India, and I decided that I would fly just once a year to visit either country. And because of COVID, I'm going to not fly at all. And of course, it's like a bit scary. And, you want to see your family. You don't want to be thousands of miles away. But because of COVID-19, I've sort of come up with new digital traditions with my family. So like weekly dinners and like recipe sharing and pub quizzes. And it's made it easier now to share and receive love virtually. And I think that's given me a lot more confidence for the years to come where I will be more low carbon in my lifestyle. So I think the key element here is really the confidence that this lack of travel can give some people, the confidence to continue living and to continue learning and experiencing things. And so I'd love for that to stick with us.
That's really interesting. I think what the general perception has been is that it's older people who were a problem for this, like a generation or two generations of older people who wouldn't be able to cope with using technology for communications. But I think the reality that we've faced, particularly working for larger organizations, is that some of the bigger blocks have been senior management who have been used to a culture of doing exactly what you described, which is going to large events, going to summits about different things, going face to face. And that's how they see important work as being done. And there's been a sort of percolation of that down through large organizations. So the obstacles have been broadly swept away, but they weren't just generational. They were certainly hierarchical too. So what sort of changes to our travel behaviors, other than obviously flying, have we generally seen forced on us? What have you witnessed? What have you experienced yourselves?
I mean, I just think the incredible drop in road travel during lockdown is probably the most obvious, and the knock-on effects of less pollution and then the health benefits of that. And also I think the dip in emissions I'd read just before we started talking that transport in Scotland accounts for 37% of its footprint, and most of that is from diesel and petrol cars. And even though I would say that Edinburgh's air is pretty nice compared to other cities, I definitely noticed a difference in lockdown, that it felt cleaner and fresher. And I mean, I don't know, I feel like the car is another thing that's extremely controversial, and people don't want to have a war on cars. And but when I was walking and cycling around Edinburgh during lockdown, I thought it was really nice to see people cycling with their children through the parts of the city that I don't think anyone would usually venture with a child on a bike. And the road closures that the council put in place, which were amazing. Like I went down all of them, especially the one down to Cramond. And it was just so nice, and so many people out with their kids and older people out on their bikes. And so I think that was, I don't want to say like COVID was so great because of that, but I think it was interesting to see that we could make that change really, really quickly. People could just keep their cars at home and start walking and cycling, and everything still pretty much worked, I think. So.
Yeah, so true. I think our equivalent of the dolphins that were seen in the canals of Venice for the first time in whenever has been lots of families going out on bicycles around the place. I found that myself. I live in East Lothian, just a little bit outside of Edinburgh, and it's been the same sort of situation that we see here as well.
I think it's also helped us, so with families going out and with sort of being in Edinburgh, having to stay, has really helped us engage with just the present. So even just emotionally, I feel like air travel and lots of travel sort of doesn't allow us to be in the present and in ourselves, because we're constantly thinking of where we're heading to next. And I think that's another interesting aspect where we really have to learn how to engage with the people around us and with, our actual natural environment. And I'm grateful for that, definitely. Although I do wish, of course, that we didn't have to do it in these circumstances.
Well, a reasonable question to say, would we ever have done it in any other circumstances? Though, and Rosanna, you talking about the decline in the number of cars on the road. I've seen some stats for Edinburgh in particular, which would seem to indicate that we're perhaps only at 70% of pre-COVID car use just now, which actually I think demonstrates to us maybe the enormous volume of cars that we had in the system already, but also how much a comparatively small reduction in total volume of cars can have in terms of our perception of the city and our ability to live here. I suppose I'm going to throw you a really tough question now. Is Elon Musk going to save us all with electric cars? Okay, go on.
Do you want to go, Sonia?
I just know. I really don't think that we should rely on technology to save us from the climate crisis. With air travel, for example, biofuels, we don't have enough agricultural land to produce enough biofuels. Batteries will be too big. I just don't think, even if we can rely on technology, I think that it's going to take way longer than we have. And I just don't think it's helpful to look at figures like Elon Musk and other, I don't even know what to call him, but we really need to address more structural issues rather than try and fix it with technology. That's just the way I see it.
Yeah, it's behavior change, and it's not behavior change if you get out of your diesel car and get into an expensive Tesla and keep driving around the city, really. I think it was interesting seeing how quickly the traffic fell. And I was wondering, I don't know how you would get the data on this, but if you could tell who wasn't driving. So is it the people who are able to home work because they they work in more corporate jobs, and those people tend to drive to work and they tend to have parking at work and all those kind of things, and whether the traffic levels will stay down, because I know that a lot of big companies are going to be keeping all their employees at home for the rest of the year. But yeah, I agree with Sonia. I don't think that Elon Musk is going to save us with the Tesla cars.
I think he's going to be very disappointed to learn that. I'm sure that was his plan.
He was waiting for this podcast to come out and for us to
Yeah, he was. He'll be devastated now, obviously. Are we... I suppose one of the big challenges, and it's a little bit unfair because we are in COVID just now and this may ebb away entirely. But if we think of the travel hierarchies, we want people to walk as far as they can. No, as far as they can. Insofar as is possible, we want people to walk. Otherwise, the next tier down is cycling. We want people to cycle. Then it's public transport, and then it's private transport at some point. And there will always be some form of public transport in the mix for some journeys. But how are we going to cope with really transitioning people away from private car use if we have so much concerns about public transport just now? And transmission. If you like, we've had a huge amount of people, I think, take up more active travel during this period, but we've also then got a big clump of people who are really, from their perspective, stuck using private cars because there isn't, as far as they would see, a safe alternative to doing that for their current journeys. Is there a solution to that?
I mean, it's so hard. I think in these situations, there's maybe a bit of the stick and the carrot is the health benefits and the benefits for the environment. I know that some people aren't interested in those, but I feel like most people are interested in health benefits and people who are really wedded to their cars. I mean, I feel like one massive solution to this is more home working, even if it was a mix of home working and going into the office some days a week. That would hugely reduce the amount of travel, especially out to, Edinburgh Park, where like RBS is and all the really big, I don't really know what part of that's, what is that part of the city called? Is Edinburgh Park? Overgrown. And I think there's been a project, the West Edinburgh Link, that was looking at all the traffic congestion out to there and how everyone was driving. So I think that home working could really help. And then, I don't know, sorry, I'm trying to arrange my thoughts, but I think in terms of this stick, that also maybe it would just help if there was a congestion charge for Edinburgh. And I know that was really unpopular the last time it was floated as an option, but I just don't think some people are ever going to stop driving, because I think it's kind of like flying. People see it as a right and not a privilege. And then there's also the issue that I think a lot of people actually don't feel safe cycling around Edinburgh, which is... That's me. I would. Yeah. I'm afraid of it. Yeah. And it's ironic because there's too many cars, right? So you don't want to cycle. So people drive. Like, I've met people who worked at the uni, and this woman was like, I really want to cycle, but I'm too scared to, so I drive. And I was like, how many people are driving because they're too scared to cycle? But I think the public transport thing is really tricky though, because of the social distancing. But if more people weren't on the public transport because they were walking or cycling, then it would be free for the people who really needed to use it. That was a pretty mixed up answer. I'm not sure that any of it was very helpful. No,
I see what you're saying. So actually what we need to be talking about in order to make that happen is to move people who are currently on buses onto more active forms of transport there, buses and trains, obviously. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just, I guess, just really encouraging people out of their cars. I mean, I think obviously there is this, I think the city centre transformation plan for Edinburgh, and that will be really great when that happens. But I think there's so many examples from European cities, not just, I feel Scandinavia is always spoken about quite rightly because they do have incredible cycling infrastructure, especially Copenhagen, because it links the sort of out of the city suburbs into the middle of the city, which I think Edinburgh sort of has, but not as much. But, cities like Seville that has a completely pedestrianised city centre. And I think there's other cities that also, Milan is planning a massive city transformation because of the reduction in road travel during lockdown. So I think if there wasn't the appetite specifically within Edinburgh, I think there's the examples from around the world where councils or, city governments are making these important changes. And I don't see why we couldn't do that in Edinburgh, especially as Edinburgh really isn't built for as many cars that travel through it every day. Like, apart from Lothian Road, most roads are very narrow. Like Cowgate, I had to cycle down every day. And honestly, most days it's just car, lorry holding everyone up because it's unloading. And I just think, who would choose to sit in a line of traffic along Cowgate at 8:15? But I don't know where they were going, so I can't really judge. But I feel like that kind of thing is just, it's almost illogical that it's happening. So why shouldn't it change?
Sometimes, behavior patterns get embedded with people and they're not necessarily considered one way or the other as to whether or not they're better for individuals. So whilst obviously nobody's, as we've said before, nobody's glad that COVID has actually happened, it does present that opportunity that it breaks those established patterns and forces us to do something else. And I suppose the challenge, Rosanna, is, has your mum been on a bike yet going to work?
Oh, because I remember I told you that she used to drive in from off Edinburgh, did I?
Yes, you did.
Yeah, that was quite embarrassing. I'm going red just thinking about it. She has bought a bike.
That's excellent. That's the first important step, having a bike to going on a bike.
Yeah, I hope she will. But I think she was also scared of cycling because she would have to cycle down Queen Street, which I've cycled down many, many times and is quite an unpleasant cycle. But yeah, I think, I had another point I was going to make and I've completely forgotten it. Maybe it'll go. Oh yeah, my point was that I've been cycling in Edinburgh for 3 years now, almost 4 years. And now I know my way around much, much better than I did. However, still when I look up somewhere to go, even if it's, quite a few miles, it's often actually, and you can check this on your Google Maps, it's often actually quicker to cycle than it is to drive. And I'm not just saying that, it actually is. So I think maybe that's something that needs to be spoken about more. You could actually get around the city faster if you were on a bike.
Yeah, I've heard that as being one of the main benefits that people who talk about making that transition actually do, even from public transport to cycling.
Yeah.
Because obviously it's the same road space that's being used by buses and cars, so they're no faster than cars are, certainly, and cycles, bicycles have ways around a lot of that. What was it that got you into active travel or cycling around Edinburgh? Was that always the default for you?
No. So we moved to Edinburgh from the borders when I was still at uni, and then I finished uni and came back here. And I was trying to save up money to go traveling, and I was working in the grass market, and I was getting the bus from Murrayfield every day, and it was really slow. And obviously I got off at Princess Street and then had to walk round. And I still am so stingy that I actually didn't want to pay £1.60 for each journey every day. So I just got out the mountain bike that I think I was given for like my 13th birthday. And I just started cycling the mountain bike into work because I was like, I'm not paying, £3, whatever, £4 something. That was quite hard work. I wouldn't recommend a mountain bike that you were given as a 13-year-old as your best mode of travel. But I would say that obviously being able to buy a bike, like being able to buy a car, is a very privileged thing to be able to do. But Edinburgh has a lot of amazing secondhand bike shops where you can actually get a bike pretty cheaply. A secondhand bike, or even a first-hand bike.
Like a silly question, but how did you learn to cycle on the road? Because I feel like you have to know what you're doing. You don't have to know how to interact with drivers, and I just don't know how to do it, really.
I mean, I still think I get it wrong. I think as I drive, I know the highway code and all that kind of stuff, but I wasn't actually sure of the etiquette. And there are quite a lot of those boxes in front of junctions for bikes in Edinburgh. And there's also, I've noticed more of those traffic lights where there's a light for bikes to go first, which are great. They're mostly down in Leith, I seem to have noticed, but they're really... But, I still wasn't sure of, nipping around cars to get to that box at the front. And then if someone's parked in that box or waiting in that box, I think I've cycled like an idiot. I will put up my hand and say that quite a few times. And I've got a lot better. I would say that going slowly is important. If I felt nervous, I just got off the bike and I went onto the pavement and I crossed the junction using the pedestrian crossing, because the turning to Lothian Road and stuff like that is quite scary. So I think but I do understand it's nerve-wracking, but I think, just going slowly, and if you feel uncomfortable, I think just getting off your bike and walking over a difficult bit of road. But your confidence definitely, I think it goes up really, really quickly. In a few weeks, you'd feel a lot more comfortable cycling around. So.
Yeah, I think all really good points. I think to address the cycling safety thing, I think we've done surveys of Edinburgh residents in particular, and even amongst those who are cycling regularly, perceptions of roads as being safe places to cycle is fairly low. And in part, that has nothing to do with Edinburgh's particular travel patterns or anything. It's simply that the safest way to do it, as most people perceive, is clearly segregated areas, which are, this is a cycle lane and this has a physical barrier between this and a car for most of the journey. And that makes a huge amount of difference. And thankfully in Edinburgh, we're actually making some solid progress on doing that in more and more places around the city. But that experience has got to be a major factor in terms of driving. Driving's the wrong word, in terms of helping people to feel more comfortable doing it. Yeah, so I suppose if we were going to make recommendations for people in terms of active travel, or recommendations is maybe a bit harsh, if we were going to give some tips for people in terms of active travel, what would you say to someone who has, and let's think of two scenarios, so someone who's currently driving around Edinburgh and wants to move to something a bit better than doing that, instead of the Range Rover with a custom license plate, going to something a little bit better than that. Or if we were talking about someone who was currently taking public transport and wanted to take a better route, what sort of advice would we give them?
Are we assuming that they already have a bike?
Oh. No?
Well, I guess think about what kind of bike you want. The bike that I cycle around the city is, I think it's actually called the City Hybrid or something like that. And it's quite heavy, which I find is really good in Edinburgh because it's very windy. So a nice, not too heavy, obviously, so it's really hard work, but like quite a sturdy bike because the roads are sometimes a bit uneven as well. Get a helmet, get lights because it's against the law to cycle without them. And I think, just there's so many great resources online that would describe this so much better than I could, but Sustrans have amazing resources for people who want to get into active travel. And I don't know if either of you know about Spokes, the Lothian Cycle campaign. I actually just went on the website before we started talking, but they have so much information for people who want to cycle. They have route maps, they have cycling groups, I think they have a quieter routes maps available as well. There's so much stuff on that website, specifically for like Edinburgh and I think East Lothian and West Lothian. So I just think having a look around at that kind of information is really useful. And then I think if you were planning to start commuting by bike, maybe for the first few weeks, you want to commute by the quietest route possible, which might not be the fastest, but there are websites to look up alternative routes so you're not on main roads. There's quite a lot of cycle paths in Edinburgh as well that you might be able to go down.
So I suppose the question is, I'm a committed Google Maps user, whether I want to find out when my next bus is coming or whether I want to find out where I'm going, basically. Google Maps, is that a good solution for cyclists, or are there better things specifically tailored for cycling out there?
There are, but I think you probably could get them on your phone. My phone's a bit rubbish because it's pretty old and I don't want to get a new one. So I don't know what the latest apps you can get for this kind of things are. But obviously on Google Maps, you can change the route, can't you? There's different routes you can take. But yeah, I guess it just would mean for a bit like maybe slightly more planning ahead than you were used to. But and
then after that, everything becomes a routine. So it's, building in your...
Yeah. And if you wanted to move beyond that, I think it's just sort of how can you make it most convenient for yourself? So, getting pannier bags for your bike so that you could do shopping while you're out. I think it's just, there's all these ways that you can get around these barriers that people see, like it's not convenient or it's not quick enough or all these kind of things. There's no way to get around the fact that it's really not nice to cycle when it's pouring with rain and stuff like that. But
working from home, that's the component that addresses when we have bad weather.
Yeah.
It's my view.
Actually, I think in general, working from home is like so crucial for sustainable and active travel and everything. So
yeah.
That's also just good for like overall sustainability, so like social sustainability and for gender equity and just so many things. So you had mentioned it earlier. I had been thinking about Rosanna, working from home and how important it is.
It's not, I think it's obviously not everyone can do it, but if you had more people working from home, then there's more space and public transport space for key workers or people who can't work from home to travel. Which I think is important.
Are we going to see health benefits embed this? So we've talked a little bit about the perception of how the environment's used, and certainly that I think is going to encourage people to continue these sorts of behaviours. But is health going to be a significant component of addressing people's behaviour change long term?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, I am a serial Guardian reader, but I also saw some data, a report reported on the Guardian that said that reductions in pollution around the world was having, I think it was saving, I can't remember how many lives it was saving because of, pollution related deaths were falling. But obviously that's a very obvious one. But I think when you start doing active travel or cycling and walking more, I think you do feel the benefits very quickly. And I don't mean just physical benefits, but I think mental health as well. I think it's better for your mental health to be outside and breathing fresh air and moving at the beginning of your day and at the end of the day, as opposed to sitting all the time. And actually that is one thing I've noticed about working from home, is like making myself go outside and walking around a bit, because otherwise you sort of get up and you eat breakfast and then you sit down, and you can just sometimes sit for the whole day and not move. So I think you've got to incorporate some sort of movement into your day and you'll feel a lot better.
What I think is really interesting is this idea of, I don't know if you've like slow travel. So there's like the slow food movement, and then there's the slow scholarship movement in academia. The idea that why are we rushing? And obviously not everyone's afforded the privilege to not rush and to take things slowly. But I think that like with active travel and with cycling and walking and with taking the train instead of flying, there is something really beautiful about the slowness of it that really allows us to sort of appreciate our surroundings and the present. And if we're doing work, to appreciate our work. And so I think the slowness of it is also quite healthy if you're able to actually indulge in it.
I think that's a really nice point and really true. I think it's also just the satisfaction that you get, because I know, Sonia, you walk around Edinburgh mostly, but I think you get to know the city so well if you move around it that way, and you get to discover things that you wouldn't necessarily see if you were on a bus or in a car. So
you're missing so much. And even with air travel, like train journeys are absolutely stunning. And there's so much that you can gain from just taking your time and being a little bit slower. And perhaps that's another way to market it to people who, might not care about the environment, or might not care about health, but just what you can actually experience and learn can be magnified.
I did see there was a company, or there were a couple of companies, I think they were in London, or they were down south at least, and they were, with the holiday days that were allotted to their employees, they were giving them extra days to travel. So it was an encouragement to take a slower form of travel, because obviously if you only get X amount of days a year and you want to go away, then you probably do want to fly somewhere in 2 hours instead of take a train for, a day and a half. But I think that would be also a really great way to encourage people who maybe wouldn't think of it otherwise, to just say, well, we're going to give you this extra time and facilitate it. Because it's like Sonia said, it shouldn't just be about an individual choice. It should be facilitated by structures around you.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about travel anyway, is not as a purely transactional arrangement where it's, you need to get from A to B and that's the only component that's informing your decision making. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks for taking part to Sonia and Rosanna. If you want to share any of your ideas about sustainable travel, then you can take part in this conversation at Edinburgh Talks Climate. Thanks very much.
Thank you.